Okay, so one of my tasks Emma's asked me about is actually just introduce codecs a little bit more, and Emma certainly did a very edible analogy earlier on, but we're just going to explore that a little bit further. But clearly, you know, our first thoughts when we come in is, well, why have we got all of these codecs? And I think what the thing is, we've got this incredibly hybrid environment now, where we are very excited by the potential distribution and repurposing of media through multiple elements. We certainly spent a lot of time talking about codecs this morning, but obviously also we talked a lot about the various mediums that we can actually deliver media to, from the iPhones, the iPads, broadcast TV, internet, etc., you know, internal intranet sites, etc. So we're using completely variable mediums, including digital signage, which is actually a very big element of our business nowadays. You know, if you go into Oxford Circus and you go down the tube, you know, you've got all of that digital signage that's going on there. So we're having to deal with lots of variable things, but why we like this is because we can distribute media and get media very, very fast, or create incredible efficiencies by using file-based media on those systems. Now, because of the variability, we have to choose what type of codec we have. So this is where, you know, things like H.264 is very common for web. We obviously used to have a massive impact with Flash. These were ideal codecs that actually suited streaming capabilities. We're live coming down, and they dealt with the process of network protocols and delivering media in a real-time environment. We've obviously got a very broadcast codecs, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those later on. And then obviously we've got our various other codecs for network distribution, etc. So really, that's one of the reasons why we've got codecs. But that's going to carry on changing. This is an ever-evolving area, and we really have not even tipped the iceberg yet of where we're going to go with codecs. I certainly remember 20 years ago, DigiBetaCam arriving, and the hoo-ha that went out because we were compressing our images by 2 to 1. It will never work. It's terrible. Look at the changing quality. I cannot work with that. There was a big EBU forum. It took 3 years to qualify that before even a broadcaster would touch DigiBetaCam. And that was amazing. We were working at 270 megabits in standard definition for uncompressed video, and we halved that with DigiBeta. That's all we're doing for standard def. So we're roughly about 120, 130 megabits with DigiBeta. We're now talking today of high-definition video being an acceptable broadcast standard of 50 megabits. So it's just amazing, the acceptance and the understanding of codec technology where we're going. But as I say, we still haven't even touched that. There are amazing technologies coming out. Several technologies that are being developed at the moment. Fractal compression. We actually believe fractals are the fundamental pattern to everything we see. So basically, if you can see an image and you can describe that image, then clearly that image can be compressed into a much more tighter point until it becomes just noise. And once we get it down to just noise and know the encryption of how to get it down to noise, we've got the most efficient element of doing that. So fractal is a very interesting one. But actually new concept is vectorization codecs. Codecs that actually understand the shape and everything that's going on, that can actually describe shapes as vectors, and then they can deliver that shape through motion of a vector rather than having to repeat those frames again. So, you know, I think we're going to be talking thousands to one very soon as those technologies come on. So there are lots of codecs. Tremendous efficiency in codecs means we can actually encode the pattern that we see in front of us into the most smallest amount of data and restore that pattern, you know, losslessly throughout the whole system. So that's going to carry on. It's going to continue to evolve. And that's been very much shown by our file-based acquisition devices out there today. So obviously I've mentioned the 50 megabit high definition. It's great with the Sony. We use a broadcast standard, an MXF OP1A. I'm going to talk more about that later on. We also have Panasonic. They actually use an AVC codec. They've taken that as their choice, but it's done to a broadcast specification. That means we're dealing with broadcast frame sizes, broadcast aspect ratios that we know how to handle within our community. And obviously, they actually do something called OP Atom. Again, I'll talk about that. But then even more interesting, things like Red. Here we are now dealing with 4K images that are actually smaller than our uncompressed standard definition files. And that's because they're using raw codecs. And this is a whole new way that we're approaching many of these areas. And this is allowing us to take the raw data off the sensor and encrypt that into actually something very similar to a codec called JPEG 2000. And that allows us to have, you know, a highly compressed file in comparison to the true uncompressed 4K file we end up with, which means it's very transportable, very easily to record on set, and obviously we can actually manage it much easier in post-production. So it's very interesting to see, you know, that ratio of compression to size of the original file really showing itself up. So carry on through those elements, and then we start bringing in probably some of the consumer elements with the Canon 5D and 7D. We're seeing a lot of consumer elements coming out, and obviously we mentioned earlier on that people could go out and buy their camera from Curry's and try and get it into their high-def shoot. Well, unfortunately, that really does happen all the time, and I think that there's a great example with tape is that clearly DV is not a broadcast resolution, okay? But how many DV shot programs actually ended up on air? I think probably about 70%. And I think all they were done is they were just dubbed up to digibeta. Not that I would recommend that at all. But Canon 5D, obviously we've got that H.264. That's been an ideal little solution for very difficult shooting arenas, etc. And also when you're actually trying to disguise the fact that you're actually shooting a broadcast program. But we're seeing a lot of footage, especially in commercials. There was a whole episode of House, a big international distributed program, that was actually shot entirely on the 5D. So it's incredible that people are getting that quality out of that image with that compression system. So one of our main elements for this afternoon is we're talking about the long-form broadcast elements, and certainly Donna and Emma have both very much been talking about very specific cameras that are actually becoming very predominant in this arena at this moment in time. Clearly Sony with the 700, the 500, the EX3, and obviously the mention of the Canon XF. And there's some reasons for that which we're going to go into in a minute. But the beauty about this is they all work within one broadcast standards. We know exactly how to handle that file type and that standard, and we have very structured workflows now dealing with those standards. And they deal with a standard which is very typically known as an XD-CAM standard MXF file. Okay, so we're going to say I'll talk a bit more. And there is a slight caveat to one of those cameras, which I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit minute. But let's explore that element a bit further. So obviously what they do is they actually encode to this MXF, this XD-CAM MXF standard. They record it to the appropriate medium. I think Donna's done a really excellent job of presenting those three mediums. So I'm not going to go too much detail, but obviously they deliver that medium to us. And clearly, there's significant benefit with the ProDis option is that I actually have my archive. And we're going to talk about archive, but that archive is actually becoming a very important factor to all of these elements going on. So let's just explore what MXF is before we carry on. So MXF, obviously, it actually encapsulates all the essence material, encapsulates the codecs, the audio types, and presents them in a way that we can actually then manage them as we move forward onto the system. There are two standards that we primarily work with. XD-CAM standard is an OP1A standard. We like that standard because then it's a single container that takes my audio and my video together in one element, so I only have one file. OP Atom, it's an important standard for us. Certainly Panasonic use OP Atom, and very importantly Avid actually live natively as OP Atom as well. And so it's important to us, but what they do is they actually separate, they non-interleave the audio. So now when we actually distribute files in OP Atom, we have to distribute the video elements and the audio elements separately. Quite often people forget to cut and paste the audio elements and there's no audio on the file. So OP1A is definitely the broadcast standard of choice, and we're seeing a significant amount of take-up and new codecs arriving that are wrapped with this file type for distribution into final broadcast deliverables. So it's going to become very much an important element of our broadcast deliverables for the future. So I thought what we should do is we should follow the great, as I say, edible analogy that came up earlier on. So here is our MXF file. MXF is pretty much, is it a 6-inch sub with meatballs or something like that? I'm not an expert, I'm afraid. It is. So, this is the meatballs of the Subway world, I tell you, without a doubt. And clearly, we've got our video and we've got our audio, it's all stuck together with an MXF dressing. So hopefully, but actually, interestingly enough, when we actually talk about XD-CAM, not only do we have our MXF file, we also have our side salad of metadata. So that comes into a great care. And of course, what we have is we need to encapsulate them and store them onto our medium. So obviously, we can actually do that. And there's all our media ready to take away. So, that gives us hopefully a good visual concept of what an MXF file and what's actually traveling around in that card structure. So clearly, if we don't copy that entire bag or that entire card, then we're going to lose elements of what's actually subcontained in that bag. So if you want a full lunch, make sure you copy the root directory of your folder. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a slight caveat. Obviously, all of these ones conform to XD-CAM standard. The key thing is you can dial in different bandwidth rates on each of these systems. But there's a limitation with the EX3, and we're going to talk about how we can get over that limitation in a minute, that only lets you go up to the 35 megabits sample. So obviously this won't support UK standards for broadcast TV. Interesting enough, throughout Europe and certainly North America, 35 megabits is absolutely fine. So understand your distribution. We were having a conversation yesterday. For your own safety, we'd obviously recommend you stay to 50 megabits, and then you're not going to come into that question, so worry about that. So what we have now is we have what is known as a native codec. This is a codec native to the acquisition format. So we can actually now decide how our post-production works. And one of the things in your planning for your acquisition, your post-production, is decide on what codecs and what formats you're going to want to work in. And the beauty is we can take that native format and we can move it forward and continue to stay in that format throughout our editing process. So Avid introduced in version 4 a feature of their software, the Media Composer software, the AMA, which allows us to bring those native file structures into the Media Composer and actually edit live within those. So we can actually decide to do that. There's a new feature coming out, so I better not mention that. But we can then obviously export that and actually encode it to our final broadcast deliverable file format. And obviously in the near future, we'll be able to actually deliver an XT-CAN file, the output of it as well. So that's great, and means we don't have to worry about transcoding, and then it means we don't have to worry about the time we have to deal with transcoding and the technology required to do that. Alternatively, we may not choose to actually stay in the native camera state, and actually we want to get into the native editing state. And there are advantages to doing those things. There's certainly some elements of speed advantages because the Avid's going to be optimized to work in an OP-Atom DNX range. And obviously there are actually other benefits we can use, certainly in effects, etc., that are useful to that. So if we're going to work in our native ways, there are ways we can actually plan to bring the native editing codec forward to the camera. And I've put up 3 products here on this sample here. And we're just going to talk about Nano Flash for the moment. One of the things we talked about this morning is detail, about understanding the detail. It's about that transition of reality of what a product brochure is to what a product reality really is. And Nano Flash was a very good example. It's a product that there was no other competition for this device. So, and we had to get to a 50 megabit recorder. So what we can do with the EX3, we can put a Nano Flash on the back of it and actually record directly to the Nano Flash, and that will achieve our broadcast standards by giving us our 50 megabits. However, there were certainly lots of issues, and I think Emma is actually a real expert in this area because she dealt significantly with this. But certainly in the way the cables were set up, certainly in regards to the way the Nano Flash didn't interact with the camera, recognizing your record times because there's no display in your viewfinder to relate to those elements, caused all sorts of problems. So it's not simple to assume that just by plugging this on, you just carry on working exactly the same. You need to plan differently. But more interestingly lately is we're now able to actually plug other devices on the back of the cameras, which allow us to create our native editing codec. And there are 2 products I've highlighted here, the AJA Key Pro and the Atomus Samurai. And I've chosen those 2. Traditionally, what they were doing is they were generating ProRes files. The Samurai actually equally generates the Avid DNX file. So here we have a true native file that we can bring in the Avid and just carry on editing as normal, without AMA, without any form of transcode in place. AJA equally announced at IBC that they also have the DNX file generation capability, so they can actually bring those systems in as well. So obviously we have our field-based camera backs that will give us our native editing solution, and we ought to just mention that we also obviously have our studio or our set-based systems. So there are obviously things like Venice, EVS, Avid's Airspeed, Picture Ready, etc. These are all computer-based devices that typically sit on the studio, and the studio cameras go live SDI into these devices. They live transcode and deliver into our SANs, ready for us to start editing all in a native mode right from the very beginning. So there are lots of ways of bringing that native codec, either from editing or from the camera head, throughout the entire post-production chain. So we have our codecs. Hopefully we've got a bit of a better understanding of our codecs now. We know how we create them. We know how we store them. We've got them stored on other things. And now what we have to do is we have to think about how we physically migrate that data forward from that point onwards. And obviously we can cut and paste, etc. And this is where we start bringing some key disciplines that really need to begin. I'm actually going to spend a bit of time talking to you about the error of your ways, hopefully, and hopefully not, of about backup and archive. It's very interesting. Donna mentioned that they actually follow a two-copy element, a RAID array and an LTO tape. So, that's great, and actually insurance purposes. Our typical policy is you need 3 copies of a backup to be truly reliable. And typically 3 copies means there's actually 2 sites as well involved, because we've got to allow for 1 site burning down. You may sound that sounds strange, but the last biggest fire in London was a post-production facility called Frontline. It's the biggest fire in London, I think, since the Great Fire. And while they were burning down, we were busy trying to pull data off of their storage stands, trying to get it out. We couldn't succeed, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, the flames beat us, but it does happen. So 3 copies are very key, and this is not an untypical model. You're out on set, you've got your laptop, you've got your SSD or your S/S or your flash card coming in. You're typically going to have a RAID array. Very common practice is a product called G-Save. G-Save is a chassis that allows you to put 2 drives in, and it mirrors the data across 2 of those drives. We've had great examples where people have assumed that they're now backed up, and then they drop the chassis and break both the drives. Guess what? You lose all your data. So the key is, if you do that, you must separate your drives, and you most certainly mustn't ship them all together. So bear that in mind. So that has been an experience we've experienced before. In addition, obviously, you may have distribution on FireWire, so you've got copies going out on FireWire drives, and then really importantly is the LTO. And we had a mention earlier about the reliability and shelf life of LTO, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the other errors that come into it. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about RAID, because RAID certainly seems to be a consistent myth that if you've got RAIDed storage, then you're backed up. And I think it's worth investigating what RAID is to understand why RAID is not a form of backup. So let's start in our early days, digibeta days almost, when you used to buy your 9 gigabyte brick from Avid. It cost you £5,000 ago, and you'd probably get up to 6 of them because you're a big feature film, so it was great. So you had your 9 gigabyte drives, but the problem we had with those drives is, A, we didn't have enough storage, and actually we didn't have enough bandwidth to get the data off in any fast time. I don't know if you remember the old codecs, but those drives would probably cope with what we called AVR6 at the time, offline, low-resolution images, which were even difficult to even do an offline edit with. So we needed more bandwidth, and we didn't have a drive technology that would give that to us at the time. So what we can do is we can gang drives together. And I don't mean just add more drives, I actually mean stripe the drives together to make them appear as a single drive. And that means, obviously, each drive I add, so we will double the bandwidth as we go through. So double the bandwidth with 2 drives, triple with 3 drives, etc. So suddenly I get a bandwidth, and what we did is we introduced the concept of RAID 0. So this fixes our bandwidth issues. Now I can really increase my bandwidth in the system. But of course, I'm now stripping the core binary data of my media and spreading it across multiple drives. And when I spread it across multiple drives, if I lose a single drive, I lose my data. Okay, it's gone. It's just gone. You can't do anything about it. So we had to think about, well, how do we fix that problem? And obviously, then, what can we do? So initially, didn't go quite there yet. We brought RAID 1 into the system. What RAID 1 does, it didn't fix my storage issues, because what it does, it mirrors that data. But because it mirrors it, I've got double the bandwidth to access that data. So that's great. Of course, if I lose a drive, that's fantastic, because I carry on working. I've got half the bandwidth, so I'm slower, but I've still got my media. If I lose 2 drives, then I lose all my data again. So I don't have my protection there once I've lost a drive. But obviously RAID 1 wasn't very efficient on storage applications, so we need to find better efficiency of doing that. And this is when parity RAID comes in. And this is where we imply a parity byte at the end of the chain. So we have our 8 bytes set up, and then we create a parity byte, and that parity byte is used to give us an element of encryption. It means if we lose any one of those single bytes, or potentially one of those drives, we can rebuild that chain automatically so we don't lose that data. So the great thing with parity RAID is we can lose a drive, but we can carry on working. But the pain with that is if we lose the drive and we carry on working, we've also lost our protection. If we lose 2 drives, we've lost our data. There's a theme here, hopefully you're picking up on. Okay. So we have RAID 3, RAID 5, and RAID 6. And really the fundamental difference is, as we go up through those grades, is our ability to rebuild our protection back in. So RAID 3, took a very long time. You plug your drive in, it would just chunder away all night before it could rebuild itself, redistribute media, re-encrypting the parity, etc. And what we did with RAID 5 and RAID 6 is we distributed that parity around so that we can actually recover much, much quicker. So if you are in a RAID scenario and you do lose a drive, make sure you've got a hot spare, make sure you plug it in. A lot of the RAIDs now have background rebuilds, but get your protection back. But clearly, if you don't get your protection back, you lose your data. And that sounds, we sit there with our laptops, and it's rare that we lose our laptop disk drive, and says, well, it doesn't happen that often. Is it really a problem? Well, actually, RAID extenuates the whole problem, and this is why. So when we look at a disk drive and we look at the typical mean time before failure between drives, we recognize here, well, we've got a big failure occurrence right at the very beginning. That's pretty much removed in manufacturing, so we don't worry about that as a client of that drive. And then we've got a nice 4 or 5 year period before we really start to see failures occurring. So what am I going on about? Why is this a problem? Well, we don't know when it's going to fail. It's not 5 years, I drop off and I'm dead. It could fail, but pretty much on average, 5 years you're in good shape. Now I have a 24 RAID stripe or 4 RAID stripe. I don't get 24 years more. I get divided by. So now if I had a 20-way stripe, I'm expecting a failure every 3 months. Okay, now what if those every 3 months come together and I lose my 2 drives? You lose your data. So it's really important to understand that RAID is designed just to try and keep our drive technology working for us, to keep efficiency. It's just not a backup. So if you lose a RAID, you must replace that drive urgently, and then obviously you mustn't rely on RAID to be your backup device. That won't work for you. So we go straight back to the statement is that if you've got 3 copies, you're safe. And I think there are very clear insurance elements nowadays that if you aren't following very strong procedures on your backup, then your chute is not covered. We had Sarah Hill, I think she mentioned this morning that they had a production where the director couldn't bother to be backing up a thing, so he threw all his camera with all his cards and left them in the hallway of his house. They were burgled, the camera's gone with all of their media, and they weren't insured because they hadn't been doing their backups. They lost their entire program. I have a post house who had a big series commission. They were using RAID storage for their commission. They kept their media live on the RAID. The series was recommissioned. They lost their RAID. They didn't refix it quickly. They lost all their data. They lost the entire episode. So they could never recommission the series again. So there's been some very serious things that have gone out there. Other elements with consideration with disk drives is, well, what I put it on the disk drive and put it on the shelf, and then I'll come back to it in a year's time and I'll keep it dedicated to that. Unfortunately, that doesn't work either. Disk drives have to be kept running or on a regular basis. The reason for that is the grease in the spindle will actually disintegrate and your disk drive will seize. We've had experiences of that as well, and typically, sometimes we manage to recover, and we have you may have heard and you may have thought it was a myth, we've put the disk drive into a freezer, and it's just enough to increase the grease that we can actually get the drive spinning and get 1 stripe off of it. But again, you can't put drives on shelves any further than that. So think very carefully about your backup and archive. I do recommend LTO. You need to consider your production plans. LTO is a tape life. It goes on the shelf. It's got a 30-year or 50-year shelf life now. I think also Sony have come out with the Pro Disc. Pro Disc, they are warranting for a 50-year shelf life. But you do need to think about your long-term archive and how you're going to move that forward. But do think about it. It's very, very important. Okay, that concludes my part. Happy to take any questions now, or any questions for anyone?